Through the cotton fields of Ravenswood Plantation in Greene County, Alabama, whispers began to spread in the stifling summer of 1839. The enslaved community had noticed something impossible to ignore. Showing signs of pregnancy at exactly the same time were both Whitmore sisters, the twin daughters of the plantation's late owner. Even more disturbing was the rumor concerning who had fathered both children. At the center of a scandal so explosive it would destroy one of Alabama's most prominent families was a single enslaved man named Isaac, who had been kept in the main house since the master's death, a scandal that would expose the darkest corners of women's participation in slavery's sexual exploitation. Born in 1815, Caroline and Catherine Whitmore were identical twins raised in the refined luxury of Alabama's plantation aristocracy. When their father, Master Edmund Whitmore, died suddenly of fever in 1837, he left behind a peculiar will that neither married off his daughters nor divided his estate. Instead, to both 22-year-old women, he left Ravenswood Plantation jointly, making them co-owners of 800 acres and 130 enslaved people. The arrangement was unusual, but not unprecedented. What made it catastrophic was what the twins would do with their inherited power. Beautiful, wealthy, and utterly unsuited for the marriage market that typically defined Southern women's lives, Caroline and Catherine had grown up. Cold, calculating, and openly contemptuous of the men who courted her, Caroline found them intellectually inferior and financially motivated. Passionate, impulsive, and equally dismissive of potential suitors was Catherine, though for different reasons. She found the rituals of courtship tedious and the prospect of submitting to a husband's authority intolerable. From the immediate pressure to marry, their father's death freed them. As joint plantation owners, they possessed a financial independence that few women of their era could claim. But with independence came isolation. That the twins were unnatural, too proud, too independent, destined to become spinsters, was whispered by polite society. If you want to uncover history's most guarded secrets, make sure you have subscribed to the channel and pressed the bell icon. Further into their private world at Ravenswood, the twins responded by withdrawing, creating a household that operated by rules only they understood. On Ravenswood in 1818, Isaac had been born, the son of the plantation's head cook. Unusual intelligence and a striking physical appearance he displayed from early childhood. By the time he reached his teenage years, Isaac was nearly 6 feet tall with features that suggested mixed ancestry somewhere in his family line. Isaac's potential had been recognized by Master Whitmore, who trained him as a house servant, teaching him to read and write despite laws forbidding slave literacy, because Whitmore believed educated slaves were more valuable and easier to control. When Master Whitmore died, Isaac was 19 years old and working as the master's personal valet. Access to the main house, to conversations and information that field slaves never encountered, and to the private world of the Whitmore family was given to him by this position. A decision that would set the stage for catastrophe was made by Caroline and Catherine after the funeral. They kept Isaac in the main house as their personal attendant, sharing his services between them. Purely practical the arrangement seemed at first. Someone who understood household operations, who could manage the other house slaves, who possessed the intelligence to handle complex tasks, this was what the twins needed. These requirements Isaac fit perfectly. Between Caroline's chambers and Catherine's rooms he moved, attending to each sister's needs, managing correspondence, overseeing household accounts. But within months, in ways that made the other house slaves uncomfortable, the nature of Isaac's duties began changing. During her evening routines, Caroline started requiring Isaac's presence, demanding he help with tasks that female slaves traditionally handled. In a small room adjacent to her chambers, Catherine began insisting Isaac sleep, claiming she needed immediate access to his services at any hour. What was happening was understood by the enslaved community at Ravenswood long before it became obvious to outsiders. This situation Isaac had not chosen. Without facing punishment or being sold away from his mother and siblings, he could not refuse the twins' demands. In a role that granted him certain privileges, better food, finer clothing, protection from field labor, he was trapped, while simultaneously being subjected to an exploitation that had no name and no legal protection. The competition that developed between the twins was what made the situation particularly twisted. Everything since birth had been shared by Caroline and Catherine: the same face, the same education, the same social position. Now they were sharing Isaac, but neither wanted to admit the true nature of that sharing. Instead, an elaborate fiction they developed that each sister was simply utilizing Isaac's services for legitimate household management. To her chambers at night, Caroline would summon Isaac, ostensibly to discuss plantation accounts or correspondence that required immediate attention. The following night, for similar reasons, Catherine would require Isaac's presence. So regular the pattern became that the house slaves began timing their own schedules around Isaac's movements between the twins' separate wings of the mansion. "You're pregnant," Caroline said, her voice flat with shock and dawning horror. Her twins' eyes were met by Catherine, and she saw her own condition reflected back. "So are you." Volumes of accusation, betrayal, and terrible understanding were contained in the silence that followed. Who had fathered their children was known by both women. That they had been sharing Isaac in more ways than they had acknowledged even to themselves was realized by both. That their carefully constructed world was about to collapse was understood by both. Their first instinct was to hide the pregnancies and eliminate the evidence. Having Isaac killed, removing the witness to their shame, was independently considered by both twins. But the pregnancies growing inside them would not be erased by killing Isaac. A different solution they needed, one that preserved their reputations while dealing with the impossible situation they had created. Cruel in its simplicity was the plan they devised. They would claim that Isaac had attacked them both, that he had raped them on separate occasions, that their pregnancies were the result of a slave's criminal violence rather than the twins' own exploitation of their power. This narrative would allow them to maintain their position in society while ensuring Isaac took complete blame for the situation. But a fundamental problem the plan had. It was transparently false to anyone who understood the actual power dynamics at Ravenswood. For 2 years, Isaac had lived in the main house without incident. He had been deliberately isolated from other enslaved people and given privileges that suggested the twins valued him highly. No sense did the sudden accusation of violent assault make, given the established pattern of his treatment. More significantly, the truth was known by the enslaved community at Ravenswood, and they possessed their own networks of communication. Before the accusations were formally made, word of the twins' plan reached Isaac. That he faced a choice between certain death through false accusations and impossible escape, he understood. A decision that would define the rest of the scandal was made by Isaac. Instead of fleeing, which would have confirmed his guilt in white society's eyes, he went to the county sheriff and confessed everything. In clinical detail, he described how both twins had coerced him into sexual relationships, how they had shared him between them, how he had been powerless to refuse their demands. His testimony was illegal. Enslaved people could not testify against white people in Southern courts. But so shocked by Isaac's willingness to speak was the sheriff that he recorded every word. Any chance the twins had of maintaining their false narrative was destroyed by the confession. Their attempted cover-up was made obvious by Isaac's detailed account, supported by timeline evidence and the physical reality of their parallel pregnancies. Deeply uncomfortable with the entire situation, the sheriff brought the case to Judge William Morrison, who faced an impossible legal and social dilemma. Isaac's testimony was inadmissible by law. By law, enslaved people accused of raping white women were to be executed immediately without extensive trial. But the physical evidence, the timing, the circumstances all suggested that Isaac was telling the truth about being coerced rather than being a violent criminal. A case that challenged every assumption of the legal system he represented found Judge Morrison confronting. A sensation throughout Alabama and beyond became the trial that followed. Obsessively, newspapers covered it, though always in carefully coded language that avoided explicit descriptions of sexual content. Explosive enough were the basic facts: twin sisters, joint plantation owners, both pregnant by the same slave, competing accusations about who had exploited whom. Details that shocked even the most jaded observers were revealed by the testimony. Elaborate journals documenting their separate relationships with Isaac had been kept by Caroline and Catherine, originally intended as private records, but now submitted as evidence. That both twins had known about the other's activities, but had maintained a fiction of ignorance, creating parallel but officially unacknowledged situations, was revealed by the journals. More disturbing were the letters the twins had exchanged, discovered during the investigation, in which they discussed Isaac as if he were shared property they had jointly purchased for a specific purpose. Calculations about preventing pregnancy, complaints about Isaac's exhaustion affecting his performance, and casual references to punishments they would inflict if he failed to satisfy them were contained in the letters. Although legally inadmissible, Isaac's testimony was recorded in transcripts that circulated beyond the courtroom. Being summoned to Caroline's chambers one night, Catherine's the next, creating a routine that left him physically and emotionally destroyed, he described. How the twins had explicitly discussed sharing him, had scheduled his time between them, had treated him as an object they jointly owned and utilized, he detailed. As lies told by a slave desperate to avoid punishment for his crimes, the defense attorneys representing the twins attempted to dismiss Isaac's testimony. But the physical evidence was insurmountable. Two women, identical twins, pregnant at the same time by the same man in a household where that man had been deliberately isolated and kept in intimate proximity to both women for 2 years. Against this background, no sense did the narrative of violent assault make. A ruling that satisfied no one, but acknowledged the impossible complexity of the situation, was ultimately made by Judge Morrison. He declared that Isaac had indeed violated the twins because enslaved people could not legally consent to anything, and therefore any sexual contact was technically assault. But he also declared that the twins had violated laws against cohabitation with enslaved people and against corrupting slaves through improper intimacy. The era's twisted racial and gender dynamics were reflected in the sentences. To slave traders who would transport him to the Deep South, Isaac was sold, effectively a death sentence that removed him from the situation while avoiding the spectacle of execution. Fined, stripped of their joint ownership of Ravenswood, and socially destroyed were the twins, but they faced no criminal punishment because their gender and class protected them from serious legal consequences. In the winter of 1840, both twins gave birth. A boy with features that unmistakably indicated mixed ancestry was delivered by Caroline. A girl who showed similar characteristics was born by Catherine. Neither twin kept her child. Both infants were given to enslaved women who had recently lost their own babies, absorbed into the slave population, where their mixed heritage would mark them for life but at least allow them to survive. Immediately after giving birth, Caroline left Alabama, moving to France, where she lived under an assumed name until her death in 1867. She never married, never returned to America, and never spoke publicly about the scandal that destroyed her life. In Alabama, Catherine remained, but lived in complete isolation on a small property purchased with what remained of her inheritance. Increasingly unstable she became, known to local communities as the mad woman who talked to herself and kept no slaves despite owning property. Alone and destitute, she died in 1856 at age 41. Unknown is Isaac's fate after being sold south. Minimal records were kept by slave traders, and men sold to the brutal cotton plantations of the Deep South rarely survived more than a few years. Lost to history is whether Isaac lived to see emancipation or died young in the fields. A cautionary tale throughout the South became the scandal of the Whitmore twins, though the lessons different people drew from it varied dramatically. As proof that women needed male supervision, that female plantation owners were unnatural and dangerous, that giving women too much independence led to moral corruption, white society saw it differently. The story was understood by enslaved communities. To them, it demonstrated that sexual exploitation in slavery operated in multiple directions, that enslaved men faced vulnerabilities that received even less acknowledgement than those of enslaved women, and that the power dynamics of slavery could create situations where victimhood and perpetration became impossibly entangled. With its complexity, modern historians examining the case struggle. Certainly victimizers who exploited their absolute power over Isaac to use his body for their pleasure, the twins were also products of a system that gave them no acceptable outlet for sexuality outside of marriage to men they found intolerable, creating desperation that twisted into exploitation of the powerless. Undeniably a victim, coerced into sexual relationships he could not refuse without facing death or torture, Isaac was. But his victimization could not be acknowledged by the legal system of his era because doing so would challenge fundamental assumptions about power, race, and gender that upheld the entire structure of Southern society. Into history disappeared the children born from these forced relationships. The boy born to Caroline and the girl born to Catherine grew up enslaved, their parentage unknown to them, their existence a reminder that exploitation created bloodlines that could never be acknowledged or honored. In 1897, while studying women's property rights in antebellum Alabama, the sealed court records were discovered by a researcher named Dr. Elizabeth Stanton. Blocked was her attempt to publish findings about the case by descendants of the Whitmore family, who successfully argued that revealing the scandal would cause them undeserved shame. Until 1973, the documents remained sealed, when changing attitudes about historical transparency led to their release. By then, all direct participants were long dead. But with oral histories that corroborated and expanded the official record, descendants of Ravenswood's enslaved community came forward. Details that court documents had never captured were revealed by these oral histories. They described how Isaac had tried to protect his mother and siblings by submitting to the twins' demands, how other enslaved people had attempted to shield him from the psychological damage by maintaining normalcy around him, how the entire community had mourned when he was sold away. They also revealed the fates of the twins' children. The boy, named Thomas, had been sold to Mississippi in his teens and disappeared from records. The girl called Mary had remained at Ravenswood until the Civil War, when she escaped to Union lines and eventually made her way to Chicago, where she lived as a free woman under an assumed identity until her death in 1903. Genetic links between descendants of the Whitmore family and descendants of Ravenswood's enslaved community were confirmed by DNA analysis in the 2010s, providing scientific verification of the oral histories and court records. That the twins' children had indeed survived and produced their own descendants, creating family lines that connected across the racial divide that slavery had tried to enforce, was shown by the genetic evidence. Absolutely. Unmarked farmland in Greene County is the site of Ravenswood Plantation today. Whether to acknowledge its history, how to memorialize what happened there, whether a marker should focus on the twins' exploitation or Isaac's victimization or the children who were born into impossible circumstances, this has been debated by local historical societies. In 2018, a private ceremony near the plantation site was held by descendants of Isaac's family, identified through genealogical research and DNA analysis. They honored their ancestor's memory, acknowledged the trauma he endured, and recognized that his story represented countless others whose victimization has never been documented or acknowledged. Comfortable narratives about slavery and exploitation are challenged by the story of Caroline and Catherine Whitmore. It demonstrates that power could be exercised in multiple directions, that women could be perpetrators of sexual violence, that enslaved men faced vulnerabilities that historical accounts rarely acknowledge, and that the moral calculations of exploitation resist simple categorization. The complete dehumanization at slavery's core is also revealed by it. A person with rights, desires, or agency, Isaac was not. He was property that could be used in any way his owners chose. Not an aberration, but a logical extension of the absolute power that slave ownership conveyed, was the twins' ability to exploit him sexually. Accidents that challenged the system's ability to hide its own contradictions were the twin pregnancies that exposed this exploitation. Had Caroline and Catherine not become pregnant simultaneously, their exploitation of Isaac might have continued indefinitely without outside intervention. What everyone knew, but no one was allowed to say, was forced into acknowledgement by the children. A system of total domination that extended to the most intimate aspects of human existence was what slavery was. How deeply systems of power protect themselves even when their contradictions become obvious was revealed by the legal and social response to the scandal. The clearest victim, Isaac, received the harshest punishment. The obvious perpetrators, the twins, faced limited consequences. Into slavery and denied their true heritage were the children, innocent of any wrongdoing, absorbed. Throughout slavery's history, this pattern of protecting power while punishing powerlessness repeats. Only because it was documented, because circumstances made it impossible to completely suppress, because genetic evidence later confirmed what oral histories had preserved, is the Whitmore case unusual. How many similar cases existed but left no record? How many enslaved men were exploited by female slave owners who faced no consequences? How many children were born from coercion but disappeared into the anonymous mass of enslaved people whose individual stories were never recorded? Disturbing remains the story of the Whitmore twins and Isaac, not despite its complexity, but because of it. It resists simple moral lessons because it involves humans shaped by inhuman systems, making choices within impossibly constrained circumstances, creating tragedies that had no good outcomes. What remains certain is that Isaac deserved protection he never received, justice that was impossible under the laws that governed his existence, and acknowledgement as a victim that took 180 years to achieve. Finally told, his story stands as testimony to the hidden dimensions of slavery's horrors and the ongoing work of uncovering truths that powerful systems have always wanted to keep buried.